There is a hidden paradox at the center of nearly every human interaction. The more forcefully you chase something, the stronger the resistance you often create. The more desperately you seek a response, approval, or affection from another person, the less willing they become to offer it. The harder you argue your position, the more firmly the other person clings to theirs. This is an experience almost everyone has encountered. Every human being has felt this dynamic at some point. Yet most people react by pushing even harder, speaking even louder, and wanting even more intensely, only to wonder why the situation refuses to improve. But what if the problem was never the effort itself? What if the entire approach was flawed from the very beginning? Reverse psychology is not merely a clever trick or a manipulative tactic borrowed from a self-help handbook. It is a deep understanding of the way the human mind naturally functions. It explains how desire is formed and how it fades, how resistance emerges and how it can disappear, and why the urge to control another person almost always ensures that control slips away. It reveals that in human psychology, the shortest route between 2 points is rarely a straight line. The 14 laws you're about to explore will transform the way you understand conversations, negotiations, relationships, and every attempt you make to influence the people around you. They demonstrate that the most effective way to move others is often to step back. They teach that the best way to be heard is sometimes to stop talking. And they reveal that the surest path toward getting what you want is to change the way you want it, with patience, awareness, and precision. The journey begins with the very first law. Law 1. The law of reverse desire. Want less to receive more. This principle forms the foundation upon which every other law stands. It deserves careful reflection, honest examination, and thorough understanding before moving forward. Because once this idea becomes more than intellectual knowledge, once it becomes part of the way you naturally think, you will approach every relationship and interaction differently. At the heart of this law lies a simple truth. People are naturally drawn toward what appears to be moving away from them and instinctively pull back from what approaches them with excessive urgency. This is not an invented theory, but a basic feature of human psychology. At our core, we evaluate value through scarcity and perceived desirability. What seems rare appears valuable. What is constantly available and eagerly pushed toward us often appears less attractive or even suspicious. Think about a moment when someone clearly wanted something from you with overwhelming intensity. It might have been a salesperson desperate to close a deal, someone pursuing you romantically with excessive enthusiasm, or a friend seeking your approval so intensely that you could almost feel their need. What was your instinctive reaction? For most people, the honest answer includes discomfort, caution, and an almost automatic urge to create distance. Now consider the opposite experience. Imagine someone who was genuinely interesting and interested, yet completely comfortable, whether or not things progressed further. Picture an opportunity that quietly presented itself without pressure or urgency. Think of a negotiator who seemed perfectly willing to walk away if the conditions were not right. Your internal response to that situation was probably very different. The law of reverse desire explains why. When someone appears to need you, the balance of power shifts in your favor. You become the one with options, the one who chooses. Ironically, this often reduces attraction and willingness to cooperate, because human beings are highly sensitive to status and relative power. On the other hand, when someone demonstrates genuine independence and emotional self-sufficiency, the balance changes. Suddenly, you become aware that you might not be chosen. The possibility of exclusion or scarcity activates desire in a way that desperation never can. This is why the most magnetic individuals in social and professional life are rarely those who chase attention. Instead, they are people who appear deeply engaged with their own lives, ambitions, and values. They are warm, authentic, and interested, yet their sense of fulfillment does not depend upon any single person's approval. Their independence is not an act, it is real. Because they possess genuine options and purpose, being chosen by them carries meaning. Receiving attention from someone who does not desperately seek validation feels valuable. Receiving attention from someone who wants approval from anyone feels ordinary. The practical lesson here is not to become distant, cold, or emotionally unavailable. Instead, it is to invest sincerely in your own growth, your own mission, and your own capabilities until your happiness and progress no longer rely upon another person's response. When your life develops its own momentum, the law of reverse desire begins working naturally, not as a technique but as a consequence of authentic self-direction. This principle becomes especially powerful during negotiations. Experienced strategists often emphasize the importance of having an attractive alternative if the current agreement fails. When you possess a genuinely strong backup option, your desire for the present deal naturally becomes balanced. You remain interested but never desperate. And it is precisely from this position of calm confidence that the best negotiations are usually won. The same principle extends beyond business into everyday relationships. A person who enters conversations with meaningful priorities, fulfilling work, valuable friendships, and personal goals carries a quiet confidence that changes every interaction. They are not pretending to be unavailable. They genuinely have a life rich enough that they are not dependent upon a single outcome. Others can sense this reality even without words. The law of reverse desire also shapes the way ideas should be presented. Someone who calmly introduces a proposal, believes in its value, and remains comfortable whether others accept or reject it, often faces far less resistance than someone who desperately seeks agreement and argues endlessly to overcome objections. Every additional argument signals that the opposition matters deeply to them. It tells the other side that their resistance has influence, increasing their sense of leverage and making them even less likely to change their position. Wanting less in human interaction is therefore not a loss. It is freedom. The person who genuinely requires less possesses greater power, not because they can force outcomes, but because they retain the ability to choose outcomes aligned with their values instead of accepting whatever desperation allows. Law 2. The law of the forbidden fruit. Restriction creates desire. Every parent instinctively understands this principle, even if they cannot explain the psychology behind it. A toy ignored for weeks suddenly becomes irresistible the moment another child begins playing with it. A book sitting untouched on a shelf becomes fascinating as soon as someone says it should not be read. An activity that previously caused endless complaints suddenly becomes appealing once it is prohibited. This pattern is not limited to children. Adults respond in remarkably similar ways. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon is known as psychological reactance, a concept introduced by social psychologist Jack Brame. It describes one of the most fundamental aspects of human motivation. Whenever people sense that their freedom to choose is being restricted, they experience an internal drive to restore that freedom. Often, the forbidden object becomes even more desirable simply because access has been limited. The restriction itself creates value where little existed before. This explains why unavailable opportunities often seem more attractive, why exclusive memberships gain prestige, why limited editions sell rapidly, and why people sometimes become intensely interested only after being told they cannot have something. The human mind does not merely evaluate the object itself, it also responds to the perceived freedom associated with obtaining it. The moment choice feels threatened, desire frequently intensifies. Understanding this law allows you to recognize one of the most powerful forces influencing human behavior, a force that quietly shapes decisions, relationships, negotiations, and ambitions in ways most people never consciously notice. Whenever people sense that their ability to choose, act, or believe something is being limited, the mind instantly generates a powerful motivation to reclaim that lost freedom. Rather than making the restricted object less attractive, the limitation itself often makes it even more desirable. In many cases, the very act of restricting something becomes its strongest advertisement. History repeatedly demonstrates this pattern. Banning alcohol has rarely eliminated people's desire to drink. Instead, prohibition has often intensified that desire while simultaneously increasing the social prestige associated with obtaining what is forbidden. The same principle applies to literature. A book that might otherwise receive little attention suddenly becomes irresistible the moment authorities attempt to ban it. Curiosity transforms into obsession simply because access has been denied. Information follows the same rule. Preventing people from learning certain facts rarely decreases their interest. On the contrary, restricted knowledge often becomes something people feel compelled to uncover. What begins as casual curiosity quickly evolves into an urgent need to know. This psychological mechanism extends far beyond politics or censorship and reaches into personal relationships. Imagine a romantic partner declaring, "You will never be good enough for me." Whether intentional or accidental, such a statement activates one of the strongest motivational forces in human emotion. It is not effective because it is compassionate or accurate, but because it awakens the deep desire to prove oneself worthy. The challenge itself fuels determination, transforming self-worth into a personal mission. The law of the forbidden fruit offers several powerful lessons for understanding influence. The first application involves the principle of strategic unavailability. When your attention, approval, or presence is not constantly accessible, not because you are pretending to be distant, but because you are genuinely occupied with meaningful priorities, people often begin valuing your attention more. Availability that is selective rather than automatic creates appreciation instead of familiarity. Those who seek your time become increasingly invested because your presence is perceived as valuable. The second application lies in what can be called gentle prohibition. When trying to guide someone toward a particular decision, direct persuasion often produces resistance because it feels like pressure or an attempt to control choice. Indirect guidance, however, can produce the opposite effect. Consider the experienced salesperson who notices a customer examining a product and calmly remarks, "I'm not entirely sure this is the best option for you. It may actually offer more than you need." Rather than discouraging interest, this subtle suggestion activates the customer's desire to justify their own choice. Suddenly, the customer begins asking questions and defending the product themselves. The pursuit reverses. Instead of being sold to, they become the ones seeking the purchase, fundamentally changing the psychology of the interaction. The third application is the principle of implied exclusivity. Whenever access to a group, experience, or piece of information is presented as something reserved for only a select few, its perceived value rises dramatically. This is why invitation-only communities, exclusive memberships, limited edition products, and VIP entrances hold such strong appeal. The restriction itself communicates a powerful message. This is not available to everyone. Often that message creates more desire than the actual qualities of the thing being offered. However, applying this law ethically requires an important distinction. There is a significant difference between authentic scarcity and manufactured scarcity. Real exclusivity emerges from genuine standards. A community that carefully selects its members protects its culture and quality. A person who chooses thoughtfully where to invest time and energy reflects the genuine value of those resources. Artificial exclusivity is something entirely different. It relies on fake limitations and fabricated scarcity designed solely to manipulate desire. Although this approach may produce immediate interest, it almost always creates disappointment and resentment once people realize the restriction was never real. And eventually, they usually do. People are often far more perceptive than manipulators assume. Therefore, the wisest application of the law of the forbidden fruit is rooted in authenticity. Create real quality, maintain genuine standards, make what you offer truly valuable and naturally uncommon rather than pretending it is. When something is sincerely rare and genuinely worthwhile, the desire it inspires is authentic. Those who pursue it are not chasing an illusion. They are seeking something that truly rewards their effort. Law 3. The law of reverse pressure. The harder you push, the stronger the resistance. Physics teaches us through Newton's third law that every action creates an equal and opposite reaction. Human psychology follows a remarkably similar principle. The more forcefully you push against another person's beliefs or decisions, the more forcefully they push back. The greater the pressure you apply to make someone change, the greater the energy they devote to resisting that change. The harder you argue your perspective, the more firmly they commit themselves to the viewpoint you are challenging. This is the law of reverse pressure, and it explains why so many attempts at persuasion, negotiation, leadership, and personal influence ultimately fail. Why does pressure produce opposition? Because pressure is interpreted as a threat to personal autonomy. When someone insists that you should change your mind, your brain does not first evaluate the quality of their argument. Instead, it detects an underlying message. I know better than you, and you should think the way I think. Regardless of the actual words being spoken, this hidden message often triggers psychological defense mechanisms. The walls go up, opinions become stronger, the willingness to genuinely consider another perspective decreases. This reaction is often labeled stubbornness, but that description oversimplifies what is happening. In reality, it is a deeply natural response. The human mind instinctively protects its sense of independence and self-determination whenever it feels those qualities are under attack. Even if the person applying pressure is objectively correct, even if the existing belief is clearly mistaken, the experience of psychological reactance causes the method itself to become the obstacle to change. The law of reverse pressure therefore recommends a completely different strategy. Rather than increasing pressure, remove it. Instead of forcing someone toward a new conclusion, become sincerely interested in understanding the conclusion they already hold. Rather than pushing them away from their current position, invite them to explore it more carefully, at their own pace and on their own terms. This philosophy has independently emerged among many of the world's most effective therapists, counselors, negotiators, coaches, and conflict resolution specialists. Within clinical psychology, it is often associated with motivational interviewing, but its underlying principles apply wherever genuine transformation is desired. The first principle within this law can be described as the principle of expressed curiosity. Instead of explaining why another person is wrong, become honestly curious about why they believe what they believe. Ask sincere questions, not questions disguised as arguments or traps, but questions aimed at understanding the logic, emotions, experiences, and assumptions supporting their position. When this happens, something remarkable often occurs. As people carefully explain their own thinking in an atmosphere free from judgment and pressure, they frequently begin noticing weaknesses that they had never previously examined. Many beliefs survive not because they have been carefully tested, but because they have simply remained unchallenged over time. They were adopted in the past, served a purpose, and continued through habit, rather than deliberate reflection. When individuals are invited to revisit those beliefs without feeling attacked, they often discover that their own understanding has quietly evolved, even though they never consciously updated their official position. The second principle can be called the principle of acknowledged strength. Before pointing out flaws in another person's viewpoint, sincerely recognize whatever truth or value exists within it. This should never be performed as manipulation or empty flattery. Almost every belief, even an incorrect one, contains an understandable motivation or addresses a legitimate concern. People arrive at their conclusions for reasons. Their beliefs solve problems, answer fears, or provide meaning. Acknowledging these realities communicates genuine respect. It demonstrates that you are engaging with their actual perspective rather than a simplified caricature of it. When people feel accurately understood and fairly represented, their defenses naturally soften, creating space for honest reconsideration. The third principle is the principle of questioned assumptions. Rather than attacking someone's final conclusion, gently explore the assumptions upon which that conclusion rests. Ask thoughtful questions such as, what would need to be true for this belief to be accurate? Then examine those underlying assumptions together without judgment or confrontation. This approach feels collaborative rather than adversarial. It becomes a shared search for understanding instead of a battle over opinions. Ideas supported by weak foundations often collapse naturally under careful examination. They do not need to be forcefully demolished from the outside, because once their assumptions are honestly explored, they lose the support that was holding them upright in the first place. The law of reverse pressure ultimately demands something that many people find extremely difficult to practice: patience. Allowing another person the freedom and space to arrive at change through their own process is almost always slower than trying to force that change directly. The urge to simply explain why they are mistaken and convince them immediately is always present, especially when you are absolutely convinced that your perspective is correct and theirs is not. Yet confidence in your own correctness does nothing to alter the psychology behind resistance. The wall standing between you and the other person does not become weaker simply because your argument is stronger. The opposing force does not disappear because your reasoning is more logical or your evidence more convincing. Resistance exists because pressure creates it. The only reliable way to reduce that resistance is to remove the force producing it, and doing so requires faith that when people are given sincere freedom and genuine support to think independently, they often discover the path you hoped they would take on their own, more quickly, more willingly, and far more permanently than they ever would through constant pressure. Law 4. The law of the stepped-back leader. Lead by appearing to follow. For most people, power has a very familiar image. It looks like the individual standing at the front, giving instructions, setting expectations, directing movement, and ensuring obedience. This visible picture of leadership is one we absorb from childhood through nearly every institution we encounter: our families, schools, workplaces, governments, and organizations. Someone stands at the top, someone gives the orders. Authority flows downward through the hierarchy. Yet the highest and most enduring form of leadership functions according to an entirely different principle. It leads from behind. It influences by appearing to support rather than command. It gains authority by sharing it. It shapes behavior by allowing others to believe they are directing themselves. This is the law of the stepped-back leader. It represents the style of leadership that creates the deepest loyalty, the strongest commitment, the most innovative teams, the most resilient organizations, and the greatest long-term influence. Why? Because when individuals experience their actions as self-directed, when they believe their commitments are genuinely their own rather than obligations imposed upon them, they invest far more energy, creativity, and ownership into those commitments than any external command could ever produce. The psychological foundation beneath this law is known as self-attribution. When people perceive themselves as the authors of their own actions, those actions become expressions of identity. They stop feeling like instructions that were followed and begin feeling like reflections of who they truly are. And behaviors connected to identity are remarkably durable. Changing such behaviors requires changing one's self-concept, a process that is psychologically far more demanding than simply ignoring an external order. The stepped-back leader understands this principle deeply. Rather than forcing outcomes, they intentionally create environments where people naturally arrive at the best decisions themselves. This does not mean withdrawing or becoming passive. Instead, it means guiding in subtle ways that encourage ownership rather than dependence. They ask questions that gently steer thinking without dictating conclusions. They design circumstances where productive insights emerge naturally rather than being delivered as commands. They frame situations so that wise choices appear obvious without making the framing itself visible. The first practice within this law may be called the Socratic guide technique. Its philosophy is simple. Replace telling with asking. Replace giving answers with creating questions that naturally lead toward those answers. Replace explanation with experience. A Socratic guide is far from absent during a conversation. In many ways, they are its most influential participant. Yet they appear not as an authority delivering solutions, but as a thoughtful companion exploring ideas. As a result, the people engaged in the discussion often leave believing they discovered the insight entirely through their own reasoning. And in a sense, they did. The realization belonged to them. The environment that allowed it to emerge, however, was intentionally created. The second practice may be called deliberate consultation. A stepped-back leader sincerely seeks the opinions of others. More importantly, they genuinely consider those perspectives and visibly incorporate them into decisions whenever appropriate. They do not pretend to ask for input while having already settled the outcome. Instead, they create authentic opportunities for other minds to shape the final direction. The result is remarkable. People become personally invested because the outcome carries part of their own contribution. This illustrates one of leadership's greatest paradoxes. Sharing influence often increases influence. When individuals know their voice genuinely matters, they become supporters of the decision they helped create. When decisions are simply imposed upon them, resistance naturally becomes more likely. The stepped-back leader therefore gathers followers who become authentic advocates, precisely because those followers participated in building what they now defend. The third practice is the principle of attributed ideas. Whenever someone within the group contributes a valuable insight, the leader publicly recognizes both the idea and its creator. Several important things happen simultaneously. The person receiving recognition becomes more committed to the idea's success because it now reflects their own identity and reputation. Everyone else observes that contributions are appreciated rather than appropriated, encouraging greater openness and creativity. Meanwhile, the leader gains even greater respect by giving away recognition instead of collecting it. Generous attribution demonstrates confidence rather than insecurity. It reveals someone committed to elevating others rather than competing against them. Ironically, this generosity often strengthens the leader's authority more than claiming personal credit ever could. The stepped-back leader frequently becomes the most influential individual in any room precisely because they appear to exercise the least visible control. The highest form of influence is influence that never announces itself. It flows quietly through systems without provoking resistance. It shapes outcomes without leaving obvious signs of direction. Those who master this style embody the deepest meaning of reverse control. The more completely they release the need to be recognized as the source of power, the more naturally genuine power flows through them. Law 5, the law of emotional withdrawal. Reclaim your power by withdrawing your reaction. Every form of emotional manipulation survives on a single source of energy: your reaction. Without your response, manipulation has nothing to feed upon. Without visible frustration, the person attempting to provoke you loses much of their leverage. Without your anger, those seeking to influence your behavior lose their ability to predict how you will respond. Without your urgent need for closure, the individual withholding closure loses control over the pace of the interaction. This is the law of emotional withdrawal. It stands among the most practical and transformative principles in this entire framework. Not because emotions are weaknesses. Emotions are genuine. They carry information. They deserve attention. The vulnerability lies not in feeling emotion, but in expressing it automatically when another person is intentionally using that expression to control your behavior. Withdrawing predictable emotional displays and replacing them with composed awareness removes the leverage they depend upon. The psychology behind this law resembles what game theorists describe as response elimination. In any repeated interaction, the person who can reliably predict your reactions possesses a strategic advantage. They understand exactly which actions produce the emotional response they seek and can continue using those actions to shape your behavior. Your predictable reactions become a manual they can repeatedly follow. Once those predictable reactions disappear, however, their strategy begins to fail. When provocation is met with calmness, when manipulation is answered with thoughtful curiosity, when emotional escalation receives measured restraint instead of equal escalation, the script they expected no longer works. Their certainty disappears. Their influence weakens. You become unpredictable in precisely the way that disrupts their control because their entire strategy depended on your emotional predictability. It is important to understand that this law does not advocate suppressing emotions. Rather, it teaches the separation of inner experience from outward behavior. You may genuinely feel anger, disappointment, fear, or sadness. The goal is not to deny those feelings. The goal is to create enough space between experiencing them and expressing them that you retain complete freedom over your response. Within that pause lies one of the greatest sources of interpersonal strength. That brief space between stimulus and response contains choice. It allows you to decide whether your next action will serve the agenda of the person attempting to provoke you, or your own long-term interests. One of the clearest applications of this principle appears during direct conflict. When another person raises their emotional intensity, matching their energy often feels natural. It may even seem justified, yet from the perspective of influence and power, it is usually a costly mistake. Responding to escalation with escalation confirms that their behavior has affected you. It immediately shifts the interaction away from thoughtful reasoning and into emotional reactivity. And in doing so, it grants the initiator exactly what they hoped to achieve: a conversation no longer governed by clear thinking, but by impulsive emotion, a territory in which they may possess far greater experience and advantage than you do. The response that most effectively transforms the entire interaction can be described as grounded non-escalation, a calm, balanced acknowledgement of the situation without mirroring the emotional intensity being directed at you. A simple response such as, "I can tell this is deeply important to you. I genuinely want to understand your perspective. Could we continue this conversation when we're both feeling calmer?" can completely shift the direction of the exchange. This kind of response accomplishes several objectives at once. First, it makes it clear that you refuse to become part of an escalating emotional cycle. Second, it communicates empathy and understanding without sacrificing your own emotional stability. Finally, it gently redirects the discussion toward a level of conversation where thoughtful reasoning becomes possible again, and where your ability to respond intentionally rather than react impulsively gives you a significant advantage. The second application of this law appears in situations involving long-term emotional manipulation, where another person has repeatedly learned to control the relationship by triggering predictable emotional reactions within you. In these circumstances, withdrawing your familiar response is not something achieved in a single moment. It becomes an ongoing discipline. It requires consistently responding differently over an extended period until the old emotional pattern can no longer sustain itself. This process is rarely easy. Maintaining composure in situations specifically designed to provoke emotional instability demands exceptional self-control. Often, as the manipulative pattern begins to fail, the other person increases the intensity of their efforts, attempting to recreate the reaction they have always relied upon. Ironically, this increase in provocation is often evidence that your new approach is working. It represents the final attempt of an old strategy trying desperately to preserve itself before eventually collapsing. Successfully moving through this stage requires genuine psychological resilience and a sincere commitment to changing the dynamic rather than simply reacting to it. The third application of this principle is perhaps the most subtle of all. It concerns withdrawing the anxious need for certainty in relationships, negotiations, and interactions where uncertainty itself is intentionally used as a means of influence. Silence, delayed replies, unanswered questions, postponed decisions. All of these can become instruments of control when another person understands that your discomfort with uncertainty will drive you toward them. Your urgency for resolution becomes the leverage they hold over you. The moment you cultivate the ability to remain comfortable with uncertainty, to wait patiently while decisions unfold, to continue investing your energy elsewhere while outcomes remain unresolved, that leverage disappears. Their primary mechanism of influence loses its effectiveness because the reaction it depended upon no longer exists. Law 6. The law of the strategic concession. Give a little to gain much more. There exists a subtle art within negotiation and influence that many people never fully appreciate because, at first glance, it appears counterintuitive. It is the practice of the strategic concession, the deliberate decision to surrender something of relatively small importance in order to secure something of far greater value. It is choosing to lose a battle that carries little significance so that the larger war can be won. It is accepting being mistaken on a minor issue so that your credibility remains stronger when speaking about matters that truly matter. The psychological foundation of this law rests upon one of the most powerful principles governing human relationships: reciprocity. Whenever another person gives us something, a favor, information, kindness, flexibility, or a concession, we naturally experience an internal desire to return that generosity. This impulse is deeply woven into human social behavior. It operates even when we recognize it consciously, even when we suspect that the gesture carries strategic intent, even when we know the generosity may have been carefully calculated. The instinct to reciprocate remains remarkably powerful. Extensive research into the psychology of influence has repeatedly demonstrated that reciprocity functions as one of the most dependable drivers of human cooperation across cultures. From an evolutionary perspective, this tendency enabled people to survive through mutual assistance and social exchange. Within the realm of influence, it remains one of the strongest psychological forces available. Strategic concession succeeds because it intentionally activates this principle. When you voluntarily yield something that appears meaningful to the other party, especially something they have been requesting or pursuing, they often experience an internal obligation to respond with a concession of their own. Without consciously realizing it, they begin to feel that balance requires them to offer something in return. The exchange has shifted in your favor. They now experience an urge to restore equilibrium. However, a concession becomes strategic only when what you surrender costs you less than what you ultimately stand to receive. This demands clear understanding, not only of your own priorities, but also of what the other party genuinely values. In every negotiation, there exists a distinction between positions and interests. Positions are the explicit demands people express. Interests are the underlying needs that those demands attempt to satisfy. A concession involving a stated position can often generate enormous gains if it successfully addresses the deeper interest beneath it. Very often, the position itself serves merely as a symbol for something more important. Consider a traditional price negotiation. One side insists on paying less, the other insists on receiving more. If both parties remain attached to their stated positions, progress becomes impossible. But when someone investigates the interest behind those positions, they may discover that the seller's primary concern is not actually the total amount, but the speed or certainty of payment. Offering more favorable payment timing may require very little sacrifice, while making it possible to secure a substantial reduction in price that previously seemed impossible. A small concession in one area unlocks a much greater gain in another. The law of strategic concession extends far beyond formal negotiations into ordinary relationships and everyday disagreements. Imagine two individuals locked in conflict, each defending their own perspective. When one of them sincerely says, "You were right about that particular point, and I was mistaken," something extraordinary happens. The emotional atmosphere changes. The defensiveness sustaining the conflict begins to weaken because the need to continue fighting for one's position decreases. As emotional barriers fall, genuine dialogue becomes possible where previously only opposition existed. In this context, concession should never be mistaken for weakness. It represents emotional maturity and strategic wisdom. Recognizing that preserving a valuable relationship is often more important than proving complete correctness reflects a far deeper understanding of human interaction. More often than not, the individual who makes the first authentic concession gains far more from the conversation than the one who refuses to yield anything until the very end. Strategic concession also plays an essential role in building long-term credibility. The person who never admits mistakes, who always presents themselves as unquestionably correct, who appears to possess no weaknesses or blind spots, often becomes less believable rather than more convincing. Everyone understands that perfection is unrealistic. Consequently, those who project flawless certainty invite closer scrutiny as others instinctively search for hidden flaws. By contrast, someone who openly acknowledges mistakes with honesty and composure, saying, "I misunderstood that situation, and this is what I learned from the experience," builds a reputation for integrity, humility, and self-awareness. Such admissions strengthen credibility instead of diminishing it. Give something. Offer it intentionally. Choose carefully what costs you little while creating significant value in return. Then allow the natural force of reciprocity to encourage others to complete the exchange. Law 7. The law of the planted seed. Influence without looking like influence. The most obvious attempts at persuasion are often the least successful. Direct arguments, explicit sales pitches, open efforts to convince. Each clearly reveals its purpose. And once people recognize they are being persuaded, their minds instinctively become more cautious, skeptical, and resistant. The awareness of persuasion itself creates psychological defenses. Agreement no longer feels natural. Instead, evaluation becomes more critical. The law of the planted seed follows an entirely different philosophy. Rather than openly attempting to change another person's thinking, you introduce an idea quietly and indirectly, without argument, without pressure, without displaying any personal investment in whether the idea is accepted. You simply place the thought within their awareness and allow it to take root. Then you step away. Over time, the idea develops naturally within their own thinking. Eventually, when it emerges into conscious reflection, it feels as though it originated from them rather than from anyone else. This represents one of the most sophisticated and ethically sensitive forms of influence because its origin becomes almost impossible to identify. When individuals believe an idea belongs to them, their commitment to it becomes deeper. Their enthusiasm becomes more authentic. Their willingness to act upon it becomes stronger. Meanwhile, the person who originally introduced the thought has influenced the outcome without ever appearing to have done so. The process of planting ideas operates through several distinct mechanisms. The first may be called the technique of the casual mention. Instead of presenting an idea as a proposal that demands acceptance or rejection, you mention it briefly and naturally within the flow of conversation. You introduce it as a passing observation rather than a persuasive argument. For example, you might casually remark, "I came across an interesting article recently suggesting that organizations adopting this particular approach often experience a completely different set of results." And then, you simply continue the conversation. No pressure, no insistence, no attempt to convince. The idea has been planted. The mind of the listener will now begin its own quiet work, often far more effectively than any direct persuasion could ever accomplish. There is no need to chase the idea once it has been introduced. There is no need to explain it further beyond the point that authentic curiosity naturally allows. Simply allow it to remain gently within the conversation and trust that if it resonates with the other person, they will carry it with them long after the discussion ends. The second method of this principle can be described as the technique of borrowed success. Instead of openly advising someone to adopt a certain strategy, you enthusiastically describe how another individual applied that same approach and the positive results they experienced. You present it neither as an argument nor as an indirect comparison, suggesting that the listener should imitate it. Rather, it remains nothing more than an engaging account of another person's experience. The persuasive force comes not from your recommendation, but from the internal logic of the story itself. The listener naturally extracts meaning from it and arrives at conclusions independently. Those conclusions feel self-generated rather than imposed, making them far more powerful. The third mechanism may be called the question that quietly contains its own answer. A thoughtfully framed question often introduces an idea far more effectively than even the strongest statement, because questions activate reflection instead of resistance. Asking, "What might happen if you explored it from that perspective?" is not an instruction disguised as advice, it is an invitation to imagine. And once imagination begins constructing the possibility suggested by the question, the idea has already entered the person's thinking without presenting itself as a position that demands acceptance or rejection. The law of the planted seed requires authentic patience. Indirect influence always unfolds more slowly than direct persuasion. You introduce the possibility and then allow time to do its work. You prepare the conditions and quietly observe. You trust another person's capacity for independent thought instead of trying to accelerate a process that must naturally unfold at its own pace. That patience itself represents a profound form of respect. It reflects confidence that the human mind, when given meaningful ideas and an environment free from pressure, is capable of reaching valuable conclusions on its own. Law 8. The Law of the Mirror. Dynamic. Reflect back the best within people. Human identity is shaped to an extraordinary degree by the way it is reflected through the eyes of others. More specifically, people often become what they repeatedly see mirrored back through the perceptions surrounding them. Identity is not a rigid structure existing independently of social experience. It is dynamic, adaptive, and continually influenced by the recognition, attention, and expectations received from the people who matter most. Because of this, the image you hold of another person, the story you believe about who they are and what they can become, is never merely an observation. It quietly becomes a force that helps shape the very reality it appears only to describe. This principle is known as the law of the mirror dynamic. At its highest expression, it is not manipulation, it is a gift. It is the gift of seeing someone not merely as they have been, but as they have the potential to become. One of the clearest demonstrations of this idea appears in educational psychology through what researchers have called the Pygmalion effect. Teachers were informed that certain randomly selected students possessed exceptional potential for intellectual growth. The prediction itself was false, yet those students consistently performed better than others. Their improvement occurred not because of hidden ability, but because the teacher's belief transformed their behavior. They offered greater challenges, they communicated stronger expectations. Mistakes were treated as part of learning rather than proof of limitation. Held within this expanded vision of themselves, the students gradually rose toward it. The mirror dynamic functions anywhere. One person influences how another person understands themselves. A manager who consistently views a team member as someone capable of development, who speaks to them as though they are already progressing toward their highest abilities, and who treats present weaknesses as temporary rather than permanent, gradually shapes that employee's self-image to align with that belief. A parent who reflects back courage, curiosity, and competence encourages a child to adopt those very qualities as part of their identity. A mentor who sincerely tells a student, "I recognize in you the ability to accomplish something truly meaningful. I may see that potential more clearly than you do today, but I believe in it enough." Law 9. The law of calibrated absence value often grows through missing presence carries undeniable influence, yet carefully balanced absence can sometimes create even greater impact. Presence establishes familiarity. Absence creates space for imagination. And imagination, when filling the empty space left by something meaningful, often produces an emotional experience even stronger than direct presence itself. This principle is the law of calibrated absence. It rests upon a fundamental tendency within human psychology. People quickly become accustomed to what is always available. Conversely, they become acutely aware of what suddenly disappears. Water flowing endlessly from a faucet rarely receives attention. The moment it stops, it becomes impossible to ignore. A friend who is constantly available may be deeply appreciated, yet a friend who unexpectedly leaves for several weeks is often missed in a way that renews appreciation and strengthens emotional connection. Calibrated absence is neither cruelty nor calculated indifference. It is not pretending to be unavailable for strategic effect. Rather, it emerges naturally from living a life rich with purpose, commitments, interests, and meaningful direction. Your absence from any one relationship becomes genuine because your attention is authentically invested elsewhere. Someone who truly has important responsibilities beyond a single relationship, who remains deeply engaged in work, creativity, growth, and personal purpose, naturally avoids filling every available moment with their presence. That authentic independence often creates a quiet sense of longing that endless availability can never produce. The law of calibrated absence applies across several areas of life. The first concerns romantic relationships. When one person is constantly available, replies instantly to every message, devotes every free moment exclusively to the relationship, and structures their emotional world almost entirely around the other person. The relationship often loses part of the desire that initially sustained it. Constant availability leaves little room for anticipation, and anticipation is one of the strongest emotional forces behind attraction. The second application appears within professional and creative work. An advisor, consultant, collaborator, or specialist who remains permanently accessible and immediately responds to every request gradually reduces the perceived value of their attention. By contrast, someone who is dependable, engaged, and responsive, while simultaneously maintaining other important priorities, communicates that their time possesses genuine worth. They may not always be instantly available, yet they remain consistently reliable. That balance naturally creates an impression of value that unlimited accessibility often weakens. The third application extends into the realm of ideas, creativity, and personal expression. Sometimes allowing space between contributions gives those contributions greater significance. When every thought is constantly shared, individual ideas lose some of their weight. When expression arrives thoughtfully and with intention, it carries greater presence, invites deeper attention, and leaves a more lasting impression precisely because it is not continuously available. The author who shares every passing thought, the intellectual who voices every observation, and the creator who constantly publishes new material gradually lose something that a more discerning communicator manages to preserve. What they sacrifice is the impression that every piece they release has been intentionally selected, thoughtfully refined, and carefully shaped, instead of being a complete record of everything that crossed their mind. Their work appears filtered through judgment and reflection, suggesting that behind what is publicly visible lies a much larger reservoir of private insight and contemplation. That impression of hidden depth gives their words a level of intrigue and significance that endless, uninterrupted output can rarely achieve. The balance within the law of calibrated absence is essential. Excessive absence does not create anticipation, it creates replacement. A person who vanishes completely is rarely missed forever. They are grieved for a short time and then life adjusts to their absence. The true skill lies in finding the right measure and timing. Be present enough to maintain authentic connection and meaningful value, yet absent enough that your return inspires renewed appreciation and genuine anticipation. Law 10. The law of the agreed-upon frame. Control the definition, and you control the debate. Every discussion, negotiation, disagreement, or attempt to influence another person exists within a particular frame. A frame consists of the assumptions, definitions, perspectives, and contextual beliefs through which every piece of information is interpreted. Whoever establishes that frame largely determines the meaning of everything that follows. This principle forms the law of the agreed-upon frame. It is among the most intellectually sophisticated ideas because it functions at a level that most people never consciously examine. They devote all their energy to strengthening the content of their arguments while overlooking the far more important issue, the framework through which those arguments will ultimately be understood and judged. Consider a simple illustration. Suppose your product costs more than a competitor's. Within a frame centered on minimizing cost, this higher price appears to be a disadvantage requiring explanation or defense. Yet within a frame emphasizing long-term value and total return over time, the identical fact becomes evidence of superior quality, durability, and economic wisdom. Nothing about the fact itself has changed. Only the frame has shifted. Yet that single change transforms the meaning completely. Anyone entering an interaction with a consciously established frame possesses a remarkable advantage over someone who either arrives without one or unknowingly accepts the frame created by the other party. Inside every frame, acceptable choices, standards of success, and interpretations of every action are determined by the frame itself. You may argue brilliantly inside a framework that disadvantages you and lose. Conversely, if you establish a frame that naturally favors your position, much of the battle has already been won before the formal discussion truly begins. Creating an effective frame involves several deliberate strategies. The first is the opening definition. The negotiator expected to fight over every detail unexpectedly offers a meaningful concession. The individual expected to retaliate chooses humor and grace instead. Each action leaves an impression far greater than the act itself, because its impact is amplified by the contrast between expectation and reality. Managing expectations deliberately therefore becomes a vital influence skill. Sophisticated communicators remain constantly aware of the expectations they create in the minds of others. Sometimes they intentionally set expectations lower than what they ultimately intend to deliver. At other times, they cultivate an image of conventional behavior so that an unconventional action will produce maximum emotional impact. Reversed expectation also shapes long-term reputation. The person who consistently performs well but never surprises occupies a dependable yet ordinary place in others' minds. They are respected but not captivating, reliable but not unforgettable. In contrast, someone who occasionally and deliberately exceeds expectations at carefully chosen moments creates a level of attention, admiration, and fascination that consistency alone rarely produces. Law 12. The law of strategic vulnerability. Reveal weakness to demonstrate deeper strength. There exists a form of strength that many people never develop because at first glance it resembles weakness. It is the strength of authentic vulnerability. This is the ability to reveal genuine imperfections, not as confessions seeking sympathy or apologies demanding forgiveness, but as evidence of such complete confidence that there is no need to hide behind an image of perfection. The law of strategic vulnerability rests upon a paradox that appears counterintuitive, yet is consistently supported by human psychology. Someone who reveals an appropriate and genuine weakness often appears stronger than someone who endlessly projects perfection. Everyone understands that flawless appearances are performances. Every human being possesses doubts, limitations, failures, and fears. Consequently, the individual who pretends otherwise often inspires quiet skepticism and emotional distance. The performance itself feels less authentic than the imperfections it attempts to conceal. By contrast, a person who openly says, "I struggled with this for years before finally understanding it," or "This has never come naturally to me, but I worked hard to improve," or "I made a serious mistake and I learned an invaluable lesson from it," often evokes trust rather than doubt. Such honesty creates recognition, it creates connection, it creates confidence that one is dealing with a genuine human being rather than a carefully managed image. That trust becomes a far stronger foundation for influence than the appearance of flawlessness ever could. The strategic aspect lies in deciding what to reveal. Strategic vulnerability does not mean exposing every weakness indiscriminately. Instead, it involves intentionally sharing selected imperfections that strengthen credibility rather than diminish it. The most effective vulnerabilities are those your audience can identify with, those that do not undermine your essential competence in the area where trust is required, and those expressed with calm reflection rather than unresolved emotional distress. When vulnerability communicates growth instead of instability, it becomes not a weakness, but one of the strongest demonstrations of genuine confidence and character. The strategic power of this principle lies in carefully deciding what parts of yourself to reveal. Authentic strategic vulnerability is not about exposing every flaw or weakness without discrimination. Instead, it involves intentionally and thoughtfully sharing selected imperfections that are appropriate to the situation and that ultimately strengthen trust instead of diminishing it. The kind of vulnerability that works in your favor is one your audience can genuinely relate to, one that does not weaken confidence in your primary abilities, and one that is communicated with calm acceptance, demonstrating that you have already learned and grown from the experience rather than still being overwhelmed by it. Law 13. The law of deferred victory. Allow others to win the small battles so you can win the ones that truly matter. Every lasting relationship, whether in personal life or professional settings, is filled with countless negotiations over minor issues. Questions constantly arise about who gets to decide, whose preference carries greater weight, and whose interpretation of events becomes the accepted truth. Most people, influenced by short-term thinking, approach each of these minor disagreements as though they are final and decisive contests. They refuse to give ground, they insist on proving themselves right. They fight hard to secure every small victory. Yet in doing so, they often sacrifice something far more valuable. The law of deferred victory rests on a simple but profound insight. Within any long-term relationship, goodwill is worth far more than being correct. The individual who consistently allows others to enjoy the smaller victories with grace, generosity, and without making their strategy obvious, builds something over time that far outweighs the value of every concession they have made. They develop a reputation for fairness and generosity. They build a reserve of goodwill within the relationship, creating an emotional account that becomes an enormous source of influence when truly important situations eventually arise. And those significant moments inevitably arrive. Every meaningful relationship will eventually face a decision carrying genuine consequences, a conflict with lasting impact, or a situation where the stakes are genuinely high. When that moment comes, the person who has consistently shown generosity over the smaller issues possesses something invaluable. They have allies. They have accumulated trust. They possess moral authority earned through a long history of not insisting on their own way every single time. By contrast, the individual who insisted on winning every trivial disagreement has already spent that relational capital. Even if they possess the correct answer when the critical moment arrives, they approach it from a position of emotional deficit instead of relational abundance. Others are naturally less inclined to support or defer to them because the relationship has been defined by competition rather than cooperation. The very moment that matters most becomes the least effective time to attempt building trust that should have been cultivated over years. Allowing others to win the smaller issues is not a sign of weakness. It is the deliberate long-term strategy of someone wise enough to recognize which conflicts truly deserve their full strength and patient enough to preserve that strength until it is genuinely needed. Law 14, the law of the returning tide. Everything you send into the world eventually returns with greater force. Every principle explored throughout this book, every lesson about reverse psychology, indirect influence, stepped-back leadership, strategic vulnerability, and calibrated absence, ultimately rests upon one deeper and more universal principle governing human relationships. Whatever you consistently project into the world of your relationships ultimately finds its way back to you. It may not return in exactly the same form. It may not come from the same individuals. It may not even arrive immediately. Yet it returns with remarkable consistency to those who pay attention. When you continually offer genuine respect to others, what gradually surrounds you is an atmosphere of genuine respect. It may not always come from the people to whom you first extended it, but over time it becomes part of the environment that naturally develops around your character. When you consistently demonstrate authentic generosity, the reward is often greater than simple gratitude from the immediate recipient. Instead, you create a reputation and a social culture in which generosity becomes the expected standard of interaction. Conversely, when manipulation is what you repeatedly send into your relationships, what eventually returns is suspicion, mistrust, and the gradual erosion of the very goodwill and confidence that manipulation attempted to secure. This occurs because manipulation, no matter how subtle or sophisticated, always carries an unspoken message about how the manipulator views other people. Even when individuals cannot consciously identify that message, they often sense it instinctively. Something feels off. Something creates discomfort that cannot easily be explained. Over time, people begin acting according to that feeling. The law of the returning tide is not merely a philosophical or spiritual belief. It is a practical observation about how reputation, trust, and social ecosystems naturally function. The person who consistently treats others as tools to be controlled eventually finds themselves living among people who also treat relationships as transactions. Genuine loyalty disappears. Alliances become temporary agreements waiting to be replaced by better opportunities. Human connection becomes shallow, exhausting, and unreliable. By contrast, the individual who approaches others as real human beings, whose goals, emotions, and well-being genuinely matter, gradually creates an entirely different environment. They become surrounded by authentic relationships, enduring loyalty and support that cannot be bought or manipulated, because it emerges naturally from people who have themselves experienced sincere care and respect. This may be the deepest principle in the entire book, because in many ways, every other law grows from it. The 14 laws of reverse psychology are not intended as clever tricks for controlling people more efficiently. They are a framework for engaging with human beings more wisely, more patiently, and more honestly. Their effectiveness comes not from deception, but from their alignment with the realities of human psychology, rather than unrealistic assumptions about how people should behave. The individual who desires less often becomes more desirable. The one who applies less force often creates greater movement. The leader who chooses to guide from behind inspires more authentic commitment. The person willing to reveal genuine vulnerability earns deeper trust. The one who willingly surrenders the smaller victories accumulates the relational capital necessary to prevail in the truly important moments. And the individual who consistently offers respect, compassion, and sincere concern for the well-being of others gradually creates an environment that reflects those same qualities back with amplified strength, transforming not only their relationships but their entire experience of moving through life alongside other human beings. This leads to the ultimate principle of reverse influence. Stop trying to dominate every outcome, and life often becomes easier to navigate. Stop forcing events, and opportunities begin moving naturally in your direction. Stop performing power for others to see, and authentic power quietly becomes available to you. The paradox is genuine. These principles have stood the test of experience. Now they simply wait to be practiced.